Recognizing the member for Kelowna Mission.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. When I was younger, I used to spend a lot of time on my family's farm up in northern Alberta. And one of my favorite people in the world was my step-grandfather. I'd walk into the house when I was 10, 11, 12, and I would use his full name, much to his chagrin, because I would call out, Delmer Eugene. My grandfather was an amazing man, and he would take me to rodeos. We would sit in the stands, and he would know every single horse by name, as well as the cowboy or cowgirl who rode them. He almost knew everyone in the entire stadium by name. Now, my granddad was a farmer, but his true love was horses. And as we would go through those rodeo grounds, he would tell me about who were real cowboys and girls and who were the posers. One day, I was probably about 13 or 14, I asked him, "How can you tell?" He explained, "You see that one over there, wearing a shirt that still has a crease with a brand new jeans and a shiny belt buckle? His hat looks new. Well, he's a pretender. He's got all the right gear, but none of the work or action of a cowboy. And then over there, that one, well, his boots are worn in, calluses on his hands, dirt ground into his jeans that won't ever come out, with a shirt that's been washed 100 times. Now that's a cowboy. He knows the work that it takes to break a horse and the job of a ranch. He taught me how to tell when something was real or fake, to not be wooed by words, but to look at the effects of work, to look at the results. Well, let me tell you, this throne speech was creased, brand new and super shiny. But it doesn't have the work done. It isn't activated. And it isn't making a difference in the lives of British Columbians. This throne speech is a lot about talk, but not about action. And as we know, talk is cheap. Action is everything. So what isn't this throne speech about? It's not about the climate. We don't need more platitudes and promises and plans. The stakes are too high. What's happened between last year's throne speech and this one? Well, the government's lack of action and preparedness for impending climate disasters destroyed livelihoods and cost lives. Heat dome deaths, deaths in fire, deaths in the floods, deaths. We have a plan, but we need action. This is not just about ideology. This is about reality, a reality that needs to be managed, a reality that is costing the lives of British Columbians. And not only do we need to lessen our carbon footprint, we also need to plan for climate emergencies. There have been unanswered reports on the Sumas floodplain and how flooding needs to be mitigated. And rather than helping with implementation, this NDP government has done nothing. And it's ended up costing hundreds of thousands of animals' lives, threatened food security, disrupted our supply chains, and will take farmers and residents decades to recover from. All this while costing double or triple what those mitigation plans might have cost had they been enacted. And where was this NDP government during the heat dome? Why did nearly 600 British Columbians lose their lives in that heat wave when in Portland, there were only 16 deaths? Why were there large announcements in the jurisdictions and warnings in Washington and Oregon and California? And here? Well, here we were doing a victory lap. We were a little giddy And I'm sorry, but I'm not content to say that, quote, fatalities are a part of life, end quote. There should have been planning, risk mitigation, emergency readiness and preparedness, alarms and alerts sent out to everyone's phones. You know what my 85-year-old in-laws have? Cell phones. You know what they also do? They live alone. You know what they also don't have? Air conditioning. They could have been alerted. And they were not. Instead, this NDP government sat on its heels and did victory laps. And now, if we had an ambulance service that could actually serve all of our communities in BC, well, then maybe we could have gotten to them in time. But we didn't, because we don't have capacity. Then let's talk about the fires. Because in my riding, you could hardly breathe at times this summer. Does this have an effect on the quality of our life and on health? Absolutely. Not to mention tourism, wildlife, infrastructure, emergency measures, and our GDP. So let's talk about the costs of these fires. Because yes, there's the indirect cost that I just spoke of, but there's also a direct cost. February 2021 BC budget allocated $136 million for firefighting expenditures. As of the first quarterly update, that estimated cost has risen to $881 million. This is a new record, topping the $615 million spent in 2018 and the $649 million spent in 2017. And as Mark Lee from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives notes, and I quote, budgeting an amount that is only 1/3 the real costs in recent years is a budgetary form of climate change denial, a belief that an extreme wildfire season only happens rarely rather than being a new normal for the province, end quote. And then, let's talk about the greenhouse gases emitted from a fire. Now, we don't have the numbers for 2021 yet, but let's talk about 2018, because it was 200 million tons of CO2. In comparison, BC's official greenhouse gas tally for the same year was 68 million tons. That's right. Our forest fire season, which is not calculated in our total, was actually 3 times what all of BC emissions amounts to. That's 3 times the emissions from powering our homes, our vehicles, our industries. And then came the floods. As if the trauma from the pandemic, the heat dome, and the fires was not enough. The floods, well, they tipped us over the edge. Loss of life, massive loss of infrastructure, and a complete disruption to the supply chain. Panic, empty shelves, families separated, businesses destroyed, homes destroyed, reserves wiped out, cities shut down, people evacuated again. People running from their homes and for their lives. And for anyone who has, like my colleague who spoke just before me, if you've ever packed your bag to run from your home and away from a fire before, you understand how disruptive that is. It's not a minor inconvenience. You are running for your life. So how effective is our climate action plan? Well, this provincial government was completely flat-footed when it came to emergency preparedness. So yes, our emissions are going up. Every single year this NDP government has been in power. but so have our emergencies. So to the countless British Columbians who want to see real climate action to protect our environment and our province's future, well, all we've seen is cheap talk and little definitive action. A shiny belt buckle, but no real cowboy in sight. Now let's talk about childcare. Because this throne speech did mention childcare. These aren't real spaces. You don't just take an existing space, register and license it, and then count it a new space. That's not a new space. It's not a new creation. So the number of 26,000 is nothing more than a shiny belt buckle. The real number, as evidenced in estimates, is 6,300 in 4.5 years. That is 1,575 on average a year. The BC Liberals in our last 2 years in power built more in the city of Surrey than that number. So we haven't seen these spaces materialize. My riding is net negative childcare spaces since this NDP government came into power. And my childcare providers are desperate for a plan that works. But you know who's also desperate? My constituents. My constituents who cannot find childcare. My constituents that have been on wait lists for 5 years in 12 different childcare providers. So perhaps in Vancouver Falls Creek, they're getting new childcare spaces, but not in Kelowna. And we're predicting job opportunities, and we see job openings, but families can't take advantage of them. They can't unless there's accessible and affordable childcare. So we've heard the hollow promises of this NDP government on how they're going to get those new spaces opened, but I don't know how they're going to do that while trying to close down the private spaces. Because even in Quebec, who is a great example for us of how they've done public daycare, they rely on the private sector. Talk is cheap. Shifting numbers is a shell game. Action is everything. Then there's the cost of living. Cost of living has skyrocketed. Food is more expensive, homes are more expensive, life is more expensive. So how is this government doing on its plan for housing? Well, housing costs in this province have never been more expensive than they are today, in recorded history. This government brags about reducing the cost of MSP for people and families, but it's less than half of the increase that they've endured in rent in 1 calendar year in British Columbia. So boast all you want about plans, but they're not having an effect on the prices of housing. Mr. Speaker, noting the hour, I'd like to reserve my opportunity to come back and speak to the House. Oh, and I'd also like to move for adjournment.
Of the debate.
Of the debate.